Whether you operate one forklift or thousands, one location or hundreds, the new My Toyota customer portal can help you optimize your operation and material handling equipment. This one-stop, free-to-use platform is designed to help you take control of your information and make smarter decisions, all at the touch of a button. Register and access your data today at my.toyotaforklift.com. That's my.toyotaforklift.com. Welcome to the New Warehouse Podcast. Today's episode is fully sponsored by Camso, your number one source for material handling tires. Head to camso.co to learn what tire is right for your operation. Now it's time for today's safety tip.
Hi, this is Darren Stratton from Michelin, and you're listening to the New Warehouse Podcast. And here is today's safety tip. Make it a part of your routine to always inspect the forklift tires for any wear and any damage. This not only ensures continued safe operation, but it can also prevent wear on other driveline components. Remember, forklifts, they don't have any suspension, so they're really relying on the tires to absorb any shocks coming through the machine.
Tires make the world go round. From big to small, the majority of vehicles rely on tires to keep them moving. But what's the real deal with non-marking tires? What are the differences and why should you be concerned with them for your operation? Find out how tires impact the material handling industry on today's podcast, brought to you by one of the top providers of tires for the material handling industry, Camso, a Michelin brand. Listen to this episode and head to camso.co to find out what the real deal with non-marking forklift tires is. That's camso.co for all your material handling tire needs.
The New Warehouse Podcast, hosted by Kevin Lawton, is your source for insights and ideas from the distribution, transportation, and logistics industry. A new episode every Monday morning brings you the latest from industry experts and thought leaders. And now, here's Kevin.
Hey, it's Kevin Lawton with a new episode of the New Warehouse Podcast, and today I am going to be joined by Darren Stratton. He is the Product Management Director at Michelin, and Michelin you may be familiar with as they are one of the largest tire providers in the world, but we're going to talk today about tires in the material handling industry and those tires for forklifts and things of those natures that we utilize in material handling. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the brands that fall under the Michelin umbrella and the history of those. And then we're also going to get into some of the details like non-marking forklift tires, what that really means, what the difference is between the colors of tires, and all those kind of details that you kind of always probably wondered, but never really knew. I know that I'm going to be learning some stuff today, so I'm really interested to learn about these differences and some of the details of these things. So I'm going to welcome Darren to the show, and he's going to give us all the information from his expertise. So Darren, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm doing great, Kevin. Thanks for having me.
Definitely happy to have you on. And I'm really interested to learn more about this topic today because it is something that I've always kind of wondered in the back of my head, but I guess never really knew. And I think it's pretty important for our industry. So why don't you start off, I guess, give us a little bit of history now, because I think even when we started the discussion of setting up this podcast, you were kind of still under the Camso brand, right? But now Camso has been acquired by Michelin, I think is my understanding. So when we look at Michelin, obviously I think the most prominent in the consumer world is tires for cars, right? But underneath that, there's the brands of Solidil and Camso, which are focused more on the material handling industry. So can you tell us a little bit about that history and how, I guess, all these companies came together under one?
Yeah, absolutely. And you're absolutely right. Michelin, obviously a very, very recognizable brand, no question as to who they are. But when you start to get down into the material handling with Camso, with Solidil, it becomes a little vague. And who are all these guys, right? Mm-hmm. So really the history goes back to sort of the 80s. And if I start really on the Solidil side, which is the focus of the material handling, this was started by two gentlemen out of Belgium, two tire engineers. who sought to do things a little differently and a better way forward, to quote the Michelin tagline there. And they saw a future in Sri Lanka, which today you see many, many tire manufacturers based in Sri Lanka. And these were really the two pioneers of that. Very quickly, they built a very good reputation for a high-quality tire. They started winning OE positions and really became a formidable force in the material handling space. Now, right at this same period, you had Camoplast. Camoplast was a French-Canadian company based out of Quebec, and they were a spin-off from Bombardier, and they were making snowmobile tracks. And then they branched into agricultural tracks onto the big farm tractors, and they were really, really the leaders in their segment. So at a certain point, you've got two industry leaders, and they start to overlap. Solid Eel had branched into construction tires and then into construction tracks. And for them, the next logical leap was agricultural tracks. And then you had Camoplast coming on the agricultural tracks, seeing construction track as the next leap. And on both sides, they were weak in the fields they wanted to get to. And Camoplast said, hey, let's go and acquire Solid Eel. So around 2009, that's exactly what they did. And it really was the marriage made in heaven. The two organizations just played to each other's strengths. It really was a great deal. So that pushed forward, a lot of progress, continued to get very much stronger. And the company was formed to be called Camoplast Solid Eel. Now, you can imagine meeting somebody in an elevator who you work for, Camoplast Solid Eel. It's who?
Very memorable.
And, yeah, exactly. And then if you try and give somebody your email address, forget it.
Oh, my God, yeah.
So we shortened that down to Camso. Camoplast and Solid Eel became Camso. And at that time, some of the products on the track and on the construction became Camso branded. But material handling, very, very strong recognition, retained that Solid Eel brand. Then fast forward to 2018, Michelin, same thing. They want to get into the space. They've been picking at it for years with their radial products, recognize they don't understand solid tires and bias tires. And us being the industry leader, all of our core values just lined up, our way of doing business, the way we treat our customers, everything just seemed to mesh. So it made a lot of sense for Michelin to make us as a target for acquisition, and that's exactly what happened. And over the last few years, honestly, it's been another great time as the two organizations were bringing together. Obviously, a lot of complexity in that, right, but also a lot of benefit. And today, we're all Michelin employees, so we go under Michelin, but we're still in that transition period where the brands of Camso and Solid Eel retain.
Okay, interesting, and a pretty interesting history there as well. I'm curious. I can't say that I am a tire expert. So why Sri Lanka? Why is that such a target for tire manufacturing?
So a lot of the rubber comes from the sort of subcontinent regions of Asia. So you've got Sri Lanka and Vietnam and some parts of China. So you're very, very close to the source of natural rubber. And at the time that we first went there, we saw that opportunity of being very close to the source of the material. And to this day, we still have a rubber plantation. We grow our own trees and harvest our own rubber, although nowadays produces a very small fraction of our demand. It's more of kind of a tourism thing now, if anything.
Okay.
But being close to that source of natural rubber, and then also you had a lot of highly educated people in what was an economically underdeveloped area at the time. And now, as you see, a lot of tire manufacturers are there, and that's just over the years, that knowledge and that skill set has just developed tremendously within the country. So now you have an awful lot of engineering talent in the world of material handling and solid tires.
That's very interesting. Yeah, I didn't realize all of that, but it's interesting how it's kind of been concentrated in that area and how you guys kind of kicked that off a little bit, it sounds like, in the history. So now, you said you're all Michelin employees now, but the brands Solid Eel and Camso still exist, but, the tires now, they still carry the Solo Deal name, right, after the history and these two acquisitions. So why is that? Why is it still carrying through?
That's a great question. The name Solid Eel is just so recognizable within this field. I mean, if you get outside of material handling, nobody knows who you are, obviously. It's not as recognizable as a Michelin. Mm-hmm. But certainly within our space, it was looked at the time of the Chemoplast acquisition and re-looked at again more recently. And the message is coming back clear every time is that the Solid Eel brand is just so well recognized in this space. Wow. Has such a dominant presence on original equipment manufacturers and machinery that our customers are just saying, you guys need to keep this. This is what we want. So we had to listen to our customers and say, okay, if you have such a dominant name in the industry and your customers are asking, you don't really want to rock that apple cart and say, nope, we're going to peel this Band-Aid off and go in another direction. So at this time we're listening. Now, what the future may hold, I have no idea.
Yeah, definitely. It's interesting. And, it's really, I think, a great testament to the company and, what you've been able to build over the years if you have that strong of brand recognition, especially in the space that you're dedicated to. So I think it's a good thing, and that you can keep carrying that name and, people still recognize it for, I'm sure, the quality that you deliver. So one of the things I think for material handling when it comes to tires is having the right intensity for the application. So can you talk to us a little bit about that concept and how does it have an impact specifically on tire performance, which is really, I think, one of the key things about tires, making sure they perform correctly. So tell us a little bit about that concept.
So intensity was something that's relatively new, or is something that's relatively new. Mm-hmm. It's a term that we brought to the market in late 2016. Okay. And this really came about by talking with our customers, just paying attention to applications, and ourselves as well as our competitors. It was just an industry standard. Had always gone to market with this sort of good, better, best philosophy. If you wanted a higher performance tire from a thermal standpoint, you went to a better tire. If you wanted a higher tire for life, you went to a better tire. The thing was, you never differentiated from thermal performance against life performance. And what was happening is we're looking at applications and saying, there's really only a small proportion of the market that needs the highest thermal performing tire. But nobody ever comes to you and says, I will take less life, please. So we said, okay, should life even be a factor when deciding on the tire? So we said, let's call it the life is a given concept, and let's set the life the same across all of our products. And if we take life out of the equation, now let's talk about thermal performance. And intensity in its simple form is how much thermal performance does this product have? So we said, okay, now that we're just talking about one axis, not two things here, we can say, okay, you're going to get the best in class life, regardless of which one you pick. Now we can have an honest conversation with our customer about what performance do you truly need in this application without defaulting to the best product we have in the portfolio to give them a mix of everything. So it's really about that engagement and having that conversation and not overselling and delivering something that the customer truly needs for what they're doing.
Okay. Yeah, very interesting. And I think being able to give that, like you said, the same life across the board, now, the customers start to look at the other applications and what is the right fit in that sense for what they're doing. So it's really interesting how you kind of almost level the playing field there a little bit in terms of the lifespan, because like you mentioned, nobody wants to say like, oh, well, I don't want them to last as long. So it's really interesting there, and I guess for those that are listening and thermal performance, talk to us a little bit about that and what that concept really is and what affects the thermal performance.
Sure. So whenever you're dealing with a solid tire, you have over time, over speed, over distance, that tire will generate heat internally at the core of the tire, essentially. Mm. And the more you push it, that's going to get to a point where it'll get too hot and it will begin to melt down. It goes sort of backwards through the curing process.
Right.
You will reach a point where the tire will simply separate. It will come into two pieces and you'll see the innards of the tire come out through the sidewall. Mm. So you can actually calculate by looking at the application, the distances they're doing, the loads, the hours that they're running, the speeds, and so on. You can actually calculate ahead of time how much thermal performance they're really going to need out of a product. And then from there, you know the limits of your products. You can then determine which one best suits their needs. Because at the end of the day, the last thing customer wants with a forklift is any kind of downtime. So if they have a failure, they've got to call somebody. They need to get a service truck out there. When that machine's not operating, it's not making money. And that's the last thing they want.
We'll be back after a quick break.
You hear a lot about supply chains these days, because if the past couple years have taught us anything, it's that an efficient, well-managed supply chain is absolutely critical to keeping businesses successful and consumers happy. I'm Will Haywood, and I host a podcast called All Business, No Boundaries, where we talk about supply chains, how they work, what happens when they don't, and the innovations that are redefining what's possible in the world of logistics. Join me for insightful interviews with thought leaders and industry experts. We discuss how optimizing supply chains can break down the barriers that are holding businesses back. That's All Business, No Boundaries by DHL Supply Chain. Listen and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's pretty interesting, their explanation. And so I'm curious, for the thermal performance now, like if people are, considering different types of tires, and like you said, we've leveled the playing field a little bit in terms of lifespan, but, how do different, warehouse and material handling environments affect the thermal performance? Like say, you have potentially a refrigerated warehouse versus just a regular warehouse with no kind of real temperature regulation. So how do those types of things kind of affect the thermal performance you're discussing?
That's actually a great question. And the answer is the ambient temperature of the facility makes no difference at all to the thermal performance of the tire. Because that heat's being generated internally, and that's due to the constant kind of compression and rebound of the material itself, it's happening internally. So what you could find is a machine operating under high speeds over long distances in a freezer may suffer from a thermal issue, but you could have a tire operating outside in an airport in Dubai and have no problems at all. Oh. So what we did to combat that is we developed a tool online, and we did an extensive survey of equipment in the marketplace at the different capacity levels. So your 2,500 pound, 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 pound trucks and so on. Looking at what were their maximum speeds, their rates of acceleration, deceleration, and then it really comes down to using those curves in combination with loads and time that the machine is operating, that we can then begin to calculate this. And we built a very, very simple 4 or 5 question user interface. We call it the intensity calculator, that it's open to anybody, can just simply go on, put in some details about their machine and application, and it will recommend the right tire for them. So again, instigating that discussion and taking away I wouldn't say the salesmanship, but taking away that mystery, if you will, and giving the fleet owner a little bit of control of their destiny.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I think it's interesting there, the explanation on thermal performance as well, because, I guess you think thermal and you're thinking temperature, right? And it is very interesting. You said the contrast there where, you have the freezer versus airport in Dubai, which are two different extremes, and it could have no necessarily real impact on the thermal performance itself as well. So I think that's pretty interesting. So when we talk about tires as well, and we're talking about solid tires here, so we see, I think, all the time in material handling talking about non-marking forklift tires. So I guess what is the actual definition of a non-marking forklift tire, and I guess which industries are kind of relying on non-marking most heavily?
So non-marking is, I mean, the definition is quite simple. Being in the name, in the tire should leave no marks. That's, sometimes easier said than done. And, obviously not all tires are made equal. But certainly with our products and with everything we develop, that is goal number one. If it's non-marking, it must leave no marks on the floor. And you can imagine when you've got 4,000 or 5,000 pounds of load sitting on a tire, right, and then you do a static turn, you're scrubbing that tire into the ground. If you were to do that with your car on the driveway, you would see the nice swirl pattern you would leave on the drive. So that's the goal, is to leave no trace that the machine was there. Now, in terms of applications, who wants it? It's a broad range of applications. Right now, we're seeing tremendous investment in new warehouses. Right. And you get to the suburbs of any major metropolitan area, and you see these buildings popping up everywhere. So with all of the investments being made, they've got nice, clean floors, polished concrete, or some cases they're coated with a paint or an epoxy. And they want these environments to stay looking nice. So they don't want black tire marks all around the warehouse. So it's really about preserving the environment and keeping their facilities looking nice. Others are ones where they at least need to give the perception of clean. So you think about a food processing facility or maybe a pharmaceutical production, where if you were to see a dirty floor, it's not where you want to see your medications coming out of. So you want that to be squeaky clean and look just perfect. There are some other sort of weird ones as well that you may not think about. So the paper industry is a great one. And the paper industry, as clean as you might think it is, they really don't concern themselves with the condition of their floor so much. But depending on what kind of paper they're producing, will have an effect. So if it's a facility producing paper towels or toilet paper, basically absorbent papers, to them it's very important, because the black dust that will come off of a tire as it's being worn off of a black tire, that paper roll will actually absorb and it will bleed up into the roll. So now this actually has a tangible effect to their production, because this is now waste paper that they can't use and turn into a product. Whereas if they use a non-marking, the dust is still present, but it's not visible. So they can still use that paper, and anything that's bleed into the roll is not an issue for them.
Yeah, very interesting. And I've certainly seen, I guess, that effect, now that you've mentioned it, and I think about it, the effect on a paper towel and it absorbing like some dust or things that are in the air, especially, working in a shop or a garage or something, and you see that happen as well. So I mean, it's definitely important. And I know, being a warehouse guy myself, I love to see a clean floor. I think it's really nice in a warehouse. So you definitely want to have the non-marking tire. But what's the difference between a non-marking tire and like a black tire?
So the main difference is, to give it the non-marking property, is really the lack of carbon black. So in a black tire, you put a carbon black, and so there's a very fine dust that goes into the tire during production, and that's what gives it a lot of its thermal and abrasion properties. So quite critical. On a non-marking tire, you have to replace that carbon black with something else, because carbon, it's like the same stuff that you'd find in a pencil, right? It's going to leave a mark. And we all know this from our cars when you see them leave tracks on the road. So we have to replace it with something else, and that's often silica or a form of silica, and that's there to replace and give us the properties. Where it really gets tricky is you then usually start to compromise on something, whether that be life, whether that be thermal performance. And that's really when you get into the secret sauce of the different manufacturers and what they use material-wise and what they use chemistry-wise. Certainly in the case of ours, the performance is very, very close, black to gray non-marking. But there's always that cost element, because when you have to start doing things differently, it usually comes at a higher cost too, which is why you're always going to have to pay a little bit more for non-marking tires. But then if you've invested all that money in a facility that's nice and clean, it's usually a small price to pay.
Yeah, definitely. And it's worth it, I think. But you mentioned in there now your tires are gray, which are close to black, right? But there's really like a wide variety of colors. So what difference, obviously we just talked about the black and the difference that makes, but what about in the non-marking world? There's this wide variety of colors, and what's the difference, and what color is the best, and why so many different colors?
Well, obviously I'm going to say gray is the best, but
that was a setup.
Exactly. Really, when it comes to color on non-marking tires doesn't mean anything at all. It really doesn't. It can give you some clues and some indications as to what is the chemical composition of the product.
Okay.
But it really comes back down to a statement I made earlier, which is, the primary function of a non-marking tire is to not mark. The color itself, we can make it all kinds of colors. And in the past, we have actually developed, on the request of a customer, a black non-marking tire.
Interesting.
Yeah, and ourselves and the customer at the time both agreed that from a marketing and sort of an operational perspective, it would be an absolute nightmare to bring to reality. The fact it worked was great, but you can imagine, no, trust me, this black tire won't mark.
Yeah, absolutely.
And if we move to like some of the further markets like Japan, they even have orange and green as non-marking products. So really the color doesn't really have any function. There's no indicator as to the performance of the tire. It's all about does it or does it not mark? And then once that requirement has been met, you better to then look at what thermal performance, intensity, and lifetime performance do I need out of this product.
Very interesting. Yeah. I was curious if it was like different levels of, I don't know, tire wear or something like that, but it sounds like it's based on whatever the chemical makeup is, and whatever, like you mentioned, the secret sauce for each company is kind of goes into it, and maybe even from a branding perspective as well. So we mentioned yours gray, which you said is the best, obviously. But why gray? Is that just because that's kind of goes with the brand, or what's the choice there?
No, actually, it's actually an interesting topic, and one I always quite enjoy. And I mentioned earlier that we have that rubber plantation being the source of natural rubber. So this is really where the gray is coming from. When we harvest natural rubber from a tree, it's white, like a latex glove. It's a latex rubber, and it is bright white. Now, once you've turned it into sheet, it's still white, but you cannot store rubber in that form. It is basically like candy to insects. So in the way that you will preserve rubber to stop everything eating it for you is to smoke it, just like you would a rack of ribs. We put it in a large container and you literally smoke it. And that turns it a somewhere between a golden and a dark brown color. And that's now your natural rubber sheet. So you can imagine if you have something now that's beginning just in the natural rubber form, to turn it anything lighter, going through any phase of beige or yellow or white or whatever else, there's a broad spectrum of colors there. You've got to do some pretty heavy processing to make it go to a lighter color. So what we do is we process that tire with the recipe that we have to get the performance that we want out of it, and it naturally becomes a gray color. And that's just the color it wants to be without trying to change it.
Okay.
And then right as a final step, we actually do add a little bit of carbon black. It's 0.1%, which is undetectable and doesn't leave any marks whatsoever. And that's there purely for color stabilization, so that you can get a tire coming out of any of our production lines, out of any mold, and they will all consistently be the exact same shade of gray, regardless of their size or where they were produced. It's just consistency. And then it's always funny that, gray gets associated as something unusual in the material handling space. But if we look outside of material handling, if you go to a hospital, hopefully not, but if you happen to be in a hospital, you look at the equipment, everything from a wheelchair to a bed, and they're all running on great products.
That's right. Yeah.
Access equipment like scissor lifts in convention spaces, or even carts running through airport terminals, all running on gray non-marking products for much the same reason. If you're using that natural rubber, that's the color the product wants to be.
Interesting. Yeah. I was wondering how that color comes to be. It's interesting that you smoke it too. I think that's pretty interesting. I'm sure it doesn't taste as good as a rack of ribs does, but
it does smell good.
Oh, does it actually smell good?
It smells like a rack of ribs should do as well. It smells delicious,
Wow.
but I'm not going to try it.
All right, very interesting. So, we talked a little bit about, obviously there's some chemical makeup that you talked about in creating the tires. And then obviously we talked about using the natural resource of rubber as well. So talk to us a little bit about, something that's really important in the supply chain as a whole in the material handling industry is sustainability. So talk to us a little bit about the sustainability of the tires and what happens at, I guess, the end of life for a tire, and is there any recyclable components here, or how do you guys approach that, and how do you deal with sustainability in your supply chain?
So that's a big challenge, especially in the material handling world, because with solid tires, you obviously have a large chunk of rubber left
Right.
once it's done. Certainly, from a manufacturing process, we are constantly looking for improvements, whether that's on reducing waste in terms of material, reducing water usage, power reduction, and so on, which I think any good manufacturing facility does. I think one other thing that is good to mention is the announcement that was done by Michelin recently called their vision concept.
Okay.
And the vision concept is really to have all products manufactured from biosourced and recycled materials, and leveraging the high-tech material expertise of Michelin to be 100% sustainable by 2050. Now, quite a way out there, but also a very, very lofty goal when you get into how are we going to achieve that.
Absolutely.
In terms of recycling, there's been investments recently by Michelin in tire recycling operations, looking at ways to break that tire down. And certainly within material handling in North America, we do, through our service operations, have recycling operations where the rubber is turned into other products and then any steel reclaimed for recycling. Obviously, metal recycling is probably the more easy part of this. And then within our factories, again, any excess and flash, we're able to grind down into a fine crumb and then turn it into what we call ancillary products, such as flaps that you would find inside pneumatic tires.
Okay. All right. Interesting stuff. Yeah, I mean, I think it's, obviously, like you said, it's a difficult one to tackle, and I think that's, the case for a lot of products that we use regularly. It's like such a necessity, right? We need wheels and tires to move and get places, and especially material handling to move products around and deliver those products to the end consumers who need them. But at the same time, it's a difficult balance of making sure we do that sustainable in a way. So it's really good that you guys have the goal of 2050 for that, and we'll be looking forward to see how those things evolve over time. And as you mentioned, it's quite a ways off, but when you look at all the things that are involved, I'm sure it's pretty intensive and a lot of detailed things that need to fall in place to be able to make that happen. But it's good to be able to set that goal. So we've talked a little bit here about kind of the differences between the tires and why would you use non-marking. We talked about performance and lifespan and all these different things. But, if I'm somebody that's not a tire expert and I don't really know much about tires, how can someone go when they're in, I guess, the market for a tire? How would they know which is the right tire for their needs? What should they gauge and what should they assess about their operation, especially in the material handling world?
So really the key things to understand are what are your pains today? What are the challenges? Are you having failures? Is it life related? Maybe it's traction. There's a number of things. So first of all, to understand what are the pains. Then I mentioned earlier, we have the usage intensity calculator tool. It's a very user-friendly, very simple tool that, quite honestly, and I mean this in the nicest possible way, but I always call it pass the wife test, because she's a very, very intelligent lady, but she knows absolutely nothing about forklift tires. So if my wife can use it, understand it, and is good with it, then to me, that's a win. And this absolutely passes that test. It's very simple. It asks you some very simple questions on your application, on what it is, what kind of truck you're running, and then it'll recommend the right product for you. So it's really taking the guesswork out of the subject. Now, in addition to that, we have a phenomenal tool called the Connect tool, and that really tells you everything you would ever want to know about our products, whether it's a solid or a radial tire, whatever that might be, and including all the supporting documents that go along with it. Now, it's called the Connect tool. It can be accessed through any browser on any device, and it can also be downloaded from the Apple Store as well as an app to be used offline. And then, of course, the next one, and I guess the more obvious one, would be to simply contact your tire sales representative and get in touch with an expert. There's nothing better than having somebody on site to look at your application and talk with you on what are the concerns and what are you looking to get out of a product, and then guide you in the right direction. And it's really not about trying to upsell and get the best tire in there. Not everybody needs high performance. It's about getting the right product to give you the best bang for the buck.
All right, very good tips. And I'm curious, as you're talking there, I'm thinking, my experience in the warehouse is, with the tires is, well, the tires that come with the forklift are the ones that are there, and then the people come service it, and they just replaced them with, I guess, whatever. I never really thought about, the brand or anything of the things that you mentioned today. So, if that's the case, I mean, what type of things can people, especially those that are like directors of operation managers, and, maybe they're noticing a trend of, they're having to replace a lot of tires on their forklifts or something of that nature. What types of things should they be looking for that may be the cause of that, either from the environment that they have them in, or even just maybe the brand that they're using, or the quality that they have been getting from their forklift dealer, whoever does the servicing on their machines?
Yeah, so there's a tremendous amount of variables, and I mean, if it was something like the tires are wearing nice and smooth and even, and it's just a question of life, then the first thing is to look, okay, did anything change in our operation? Do we have people covering greater distance, going places they didn't? Maybe they're running outside on a rough concrete pad that's new that they weren't doing previously. But also the key is, okay, run a test. Let's see what is the cost per hour of products, and don't be afraid to compare one brand to another. Certainly, that's something we always encourage. We do a lot of testing to ensure that we are in that leadership position, and really measure that. What is that true cost per hour? And then other things you can look at are things if you are seeing a lot of damage with chunking or tires or pieces coming out, which is usually caused by hitting dock plates or running over the corners of pallets and things like this, are you using a tire with a high content of natural rubber? So we mentioned natural rubber a few times here today. Yeah. And natural rubber has a phenomenal benefit of being very, very resistant to cutting and chunking. So if you've ever run over a pallet strap with one of those steel bands and you get a big cut into the tire, and it'll go in like a knife edge. Yeah. You can grab the edge of that with a pair of pliers on a high natural rubber tire and pull on it all day. You will not pull any rubber off of that tire. It'll still run full service without issue. So if you have chunks coming out of tires, chances are you're running something that's very heavy on synthetic rubbers as opposed to a natural rubber. And then lastly, don't neglect the maintenance of the lift. Certainly anything where if you've got bearings that are getting hot or brakes that are dragging or anything that's out of alignment, all of these things can have impact on the tires. The tires are usually that weak link in the chain, as they're a wear item, so they're usually where the issues show up, but not necessarily where the issues began.
Yeah, very interesting. And, I think the one thing about the chunking is certainly something I've dealt with as well. And, we focus on keeping the floors clean and all things of those natures. But I didn't realize that the natural rubber content can play into that as well. So it's a pretty interesting takeaway there. So I really appreciate, all the insights and the tips and everything on the tires differences and what's the right one for you and how to determine that as well. But I'm curious, what does the future for tires and material handling industry look like, especially as, we talked a lot about forklifts here, but, we have a lot of robots coming into the warehouse as well, which obviously are on wheels as well as they need to get around. So what does the future of tires and material handling industry look like? Is there any new technologies on the horizon, or are we just making different sizes for robots, or how does that work?
Boy, that's the multi-million-dollar question right there. So yeah, there's a lot of trends. I think we're at a very interesting time in the tire world for material handling, because you've got, like you said, robots coming out. You've got these HEV vehicles. You've got different fuels, different drivetrain technologies. There's so much going on right now that it's very difficult to predict where this is going to go, what will be the dominant driving factor. So certainly there's focus on electrification coming, as well as alternate fuels such as hydrogen fuel cells and so on. So this is really going to lead to a larger focus on things such as rolling resistance, which has a direct effect on the consumption of fuel and energy. So we're going to see more and more demand and drive towards lowering and getting very, very efficient tires. And as part of that also comes the need to lower vibration, as that actually will play hand in hand with the rolling resistance. But also, as we get more towards robots and AGVs, you're removing the operator from the equation, which can also remove the ability of acknowledging when there's an issue with the tire. Do you have a flat tire? Did something come apart? Is something going wrong? So we're going to need to make sure that the tires are as robust as possible, taking into account sort of every eventuality on that machine, to prevent any kind of downtime that may not be traceable. If this machine's working in the back of a building somewhere and you have no idea, it needs to be very, very secure. Now, of course, with that, we can't obviously ignore the connected world. Everything is connected nowadays. And we're seeing that already with things such as TPMS, which has been in passenger vehicles for many, many years. But we're now seeing in larger capacity forklifts, container handlers, port equipment, and so on. And it will not be of any surprise to see this come down into smaller machines, be it a forklift or other industrial equipment. And at some point, there will be a need, I'm sure, for deeper integration into the OEM's machine itself and to have some kind of connected product.
Interesting. Yeah. I didn't even think about, like you said, the tire pressure monitor system, bringing that into the material handling industry as well. So that's pretty interesting. And I think it'll be interesting to see how it evolves over time as well. And I think, just like you said, it's a multi-million-dollar question, I guess, if you can crack it right and get in front of it. So yeah, I mean, it'd be really interesting to see, how those things develop, and, I really would be interested in having you on in the future, as well as some of those technologies play out and how those things kind of evolve over time. So really appreciate you coming on the show, Darren, and talking to me about all these things and educating me really on all the ins and outs of tires in the material handling industry. So how can people find out more information about, I guess, Michelin and Solidil and the material handling side of Michelin and their tires?
So the best way, I would say, is you can either go to camso.co, the website for everything material handling, also with the Michelin.com website it's under the Earth Mover heading.
Okay.
And by far the best way to connect and learn about our products is through our Connect tool, which again, if you search for Michelin Connect, you will find the tool directly there. And through those channels, by far the best methods, and will certainly get you into the hands of a professional from that point.
Okay, great. And we'll put all those links at thenewwarehouse.com as well so people can easily access them. So, Darren, thank you so much for your time today, and thank you for talking to us about Forklift tires.
You've been listening to the New Warehouse Podcast with Kevin Lawton. Subscribe and check us out online at thenewwarehouse.com.
Thank you for listening to this episode. If you want more content from the New Warehouse, check out our new video series called All Hands on LinkedIn. Just search for the New Warehouse on LinkedIn and follow along.